Actually, two more of them.
Good afternoon. My name is Charles Royer, the Director of the Institute of Politics, and I'm going to be moderating this end of our discussion on immigration and the effect of Proposition 187 in California. We have four panelists in California and four here, and I just wanted to give you a little idea about how this is going to go so that you will know when it's your turn to get into this discussion. Everything's working fine except for the video. We're not getting video from California, but we will have audio. So if you came here just to see California, you're out of luck. But you're going to be able to hear California, and I think this will work fine without the video connection. Our audiovisual people work very hard to make this machine, this setup work, but it's just not going to happen, at least by the time we have to do this. But it's going to work fine in terms of our ability to get the information out. What you're going to have to work pretty hard at is to keep track of those four Californians that you're asking, California panelists that you're asking questions of, and we'll try to make that as we'll try to be as helpful as possible with by identifying each other, by identifying ourselves as we speak, and that sort of thing. We're going to start at precisely 5 o'clock. The Dean of the Graduate School of Public Policy in Berkeley will introduce the California panel, and then we'll come to me, and I'll introduce the folks here in Boston, and Michael Fix, who has authored the Urban Institute's report on the impact of immigration in the States. He'll speak for about 5 minutes, and we'll go back to California, where the panel, four people on the panel, will speak to this issue. Chief economist for Governor Wilson, you know the folks if you've read the poster. Then it will come back to the Boston panel for a brief series of questions of California, and then our panelists, the remaining three panelists here in Boston, will speak. Dennis Hayashi, Robert Soro, and John Tresvigna. About 5:45, if everything goes absolutely according to plan, which it won't, we'll probably be a little bit later than that, but about 5:45, we will get into an interactive session between the two panels in Boston and California. I've asked the panelists to identify themselves when they speak so that you'll know who's speaking in California without being able to see them on the screen. At about 5:55, sometime around 6, I'm going to ask for the Q's and A's to start. We'll start in California, and audience members in California will ask questions of the Boston panel, and you all will be able to ask questions of the California panel. Now, you'll ask those questions from these two microphones. Just line up there. If we do this right, if people don't go too long, if you keep your questions and answers and the panel keeps the answers short, we'll be able to get in quite a few Q's and A's, I think, in the roughly 30 minutes, 25 minutes we have for that part of the program. Then the Dean and I will thank people, and we'll unplug at 6:30. At 6:30, I've asked the panelists here if they'd be willing to stay for a while in case there are other questions that you all would like to ask of them, and they've agreed to do that, so we can get into more of a full discussion here after we've dispatched California. Any questions on that? Or okay, well, thank you all very much for coming, and we'll start in about 5 minutes.
And did she say we can't move these things? Yeah. It's been like Casey went through. Legislature passed that. I don't remember.
Hello, Harvard. Hello, those of you who are here in this auditorium in Berkeley. I'm Dean Smolensky, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this, the first of what we hope to be many interchanges between the two coasts on important issues of the day. The issue for today is immigration and the discussions underway all over the country about immigration policy. California, the state with the largest immigrant population, is being looked to by other states, Texas, Florida, New York, as perhaps a leader in formulating immigration policy. The discussion, of course, is especially timely for us here now because in our upcoming election we have a major ballot initiative which would affect the delivery of public services to undocumented immigrants. Will that be something that other states will want to follow with or not? Clearly, that's a significant issue for us today. So by having this California issue addressed across the country, we hope that we can put this, our own parochial point of view into a national perspective. Our procedure will be as follows. I will introduce the California panel. They will each speak for 5 minutes each. That will be followed by a question period for 5 minutes from the panelists at Harvard. And then we will reverse that procedure and then open for general questions from the audience. Our panel, briefly, consists of Ron Takaki, a professor of ethnic studies, grandson of Japanese immigrant plantation laborers in Hawaii. He holds a PhD in American history from this great university. A professor for over 2 decades, he has received these distinguished teaching awards from the Berkeley faculty and has served as both department chair and graduate advisor for the PhD program. Professor Takaki has written extensively on immigrant issues. Valerie Small-Navarro is the legislative advocate for the ACLU in Sacramento. She has worked extensively on immigrant issues as National Director of the Immigrants' Rights Program with MALDEF, the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Philip Romero is the Chief Economist from Governor Wilson's office. He also serves as Chief Deputy Director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. And that office deals with issues such as legal reform, fiscal policy, and economic policy. As a special treat, Mr. Romero is a PhD in public policy from the Rand School of Public Policy. William Tamayo is managing attorney for the Asian Law Caucus. Mr. Tamayo has served as co-counsel in various issues, including challenging immigration raids, stopping the immigration exclusion of Asian elderly who receive public benefits, stopping the deportation of foreign-trained Filipino nurses, and so on. He was co-counsel in the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission versus Soteria LeMahieu, a landmark decision holding that undocumented workers are protected by the employment discrimination provisions of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. With those introductions, I turn the mic now over to Professor Takaki.
Thanks, Dean Smolensky. The question is, immigration reform, does California have the answer? Well, California has an answer. It's called Proposition 187. The problem, in my view, is that California, in this case, had the wrong answer. I'm a historian, and the current backlash against illegal immigrants today reminds me of a backlash that took place in California and also in the country about 100 years ago, when the United States Congress passed in 1882 the Chinese Exclusion Act. At that time, the Chinese were blamed for America's economic woes. And California spearheaded this drive against Chinese immigrants. California, as a state, was the tail that wagged the dog, if you will. Okay? And here again, I'm afraid that California will become the tail that will wag the dog called the United States of America, showing America the way to deal with the problems of illegal immigration. Now, I'm not saying that we don't have the presence of illegal immigrants in California. I'm asking whether or not they are the cause of our economic problems. You see. And here I think our political leaders, our public policy makers, have been barking up the wrong tree by blaming the immigrants for our problems. The real question, I believe, is, well, this. How do you revitalize a California economy which, until the end of the Cold War, was immensely dependent upon defense contracts? About 25 cents of every Pentagon dollar had been spent in California. This is the reason why the California economy is in trouble today. It's not because we have too many illegal immigrants. So, like a century ago, when the Chinese were blamed for California's and America's economic problems, today we find illegal immigrants becoming the scapegoat of our economic frustration.
Thank you, Professor Takaki. Being an amateur, I left my directions, and Harvard, I'm sorry. I would now like, with that introduction, to turn to the Boston panel, where Charlie Royer will introduce the panelists at once.
Well, thank you, Dean Smolensky. We can hear you fine. Yours is a disembodied voice because the video isn't working. But if we will all identify ourselves and speak slowly and clearly, I think we'll be able to bring this forum off in a way that will help to throw some light on this issue. Let me just welcome you to the forum from faraway Berkeley and that great university. To this one, and
You say you were the Berkeley of the East, is that right?
and just say that our panel is ready, and let me just introduce them for you, and then let Michael Fix from the Urban Institute speak about some general study results on this issue, and then return to the other three members of your panel if you think that's appropriate. Our panel includes Dennis Hayashi, who is the Director of the Office of Civil Rights for the Department of Health and Human Services. He's a member of a White House working group on immigration, former national director of the Japanese American Citizens League, and attorney for the Asian Law Caucus. Roberto Suro is a Washington Post staff writer with a long history in journalism of covering immigration issues. New York Times, where he was the bureau chief in Houston from '89 to '93 and got a sense of what's going on in that state of Texas, which also shares some of these issues with California. Time magazine from '78 to '85, extensive writing and reporting background on these issues. John Tresvigna, Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Legislative Affairs in the Justice Department from 1987 to 1993. He served in the Congress on the Senate Judiciary Committee staff, handling policy areas of civil rights, immigration, and judicial nominations. He's the former legislative counsel to the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund in Washington, D.C. To get us started off, we thought it would be helpful to ask Michael Fix, who is a lawyer and a senior research associate with the Urban Institute, to talk about the first ever systematic study of the costs of illegal immigration in the country, which was commissioned by the federal government and carried out by the Urban Institute. Michael is a director there at the Institute of the Immigrant Policy Program, so we've asked him to take about 5 minutes and talk about the results of that study. Michael Fix.
Thanks very much. Let me just give you a few facts and figures as a way of context for the conversation that we're going to have today about illegal immigration to the United States, a phenomenon that I would submit is fervently opposed but comparatively little understood. Despite most Americans' belief that to the contrary, the great majority of immigrants who come to this country come in legal status. About 90% of the 20 million foreign-born immigrants in the United States today are here with the express consent of the nation. Begs the question, how many undocumented illegal immigrants are there in the United States today? We did an analysis, and the Immigration and Naturalization Service did a separate analysis using quite different techniques, and we came out with remarkably similar results, which indicated that there are about 4 million undocumented immigrants in the United States today, a number that grows by about 300,000 each year. Now, make no mistake about it, these numbers are contested, but they are contested at the margin. Some people say 3, some people say 4 million. But if you go back a decade, you see the progress that we've made. A decade ago, the debate was whether we had 3 million illegal immigrants in the United States or 15 million. Now, contrary to popular belief, less than 1/2 of the illegal immigrants in the United States actually enter across the southern border without inspection, walk across the southern border. Most illegal immigrants fly into the United States legally, and they overstay their visas. And this is a fact that I would submit has a profound but very little appreciated set of implications for the wisdom of focusing most of our enforcement resources on the border. To my mind, the most salient fact about illegal immigration is its concentration. Immigration in general is a concentrated phenomenon, but illegal immigration is even more so. Almost 90% of the illegal immigrant population in the United States lives in just 7 states. 40% live in California. But the scale of the problem may be unique in California, where the share of the total population that is illegal is about 5%, which is double the share of the population that is illegal in the second closest state, which is New York. The obvious correlate of concentration, then, is going to be costs. And here I come to our study. In our recent study, we found that the costs of illegal immigration, we looked at the costs of illegal immigration for the Office of Management and Budget, and we looked at the 7 major receiving states, and we looked at the state costs, not the federal costs, but the state costs of illegal immigrants. And what we found was the cost of incarcerating illegal immigrants was about $471 million per year. 70% of those costs were borne by California. The state and local costs of providing elementary and secondary education was about $3 billion a year. 1.3 billion of that was borne by California. And when we looked at emergency medical care, the other, if you will, big-ticket item, we found that it was less of a big-ticket item than we suspected. The total annual costs there were in the range of $200 to $400 million a year. But importantly, at the same time, we found that illegal immigrants made sizable contributions to these state and local tax systems, that they paid about $2 billion in state sales, property, and income taxes. However, their share of state and local taxes that they paid was less than the share of the population that they represented. At the same time, though, a fact that's frequently lost is that they paid about $3.5 billion in federal income taxes. Now, these results are consistent with other Urban Institute work in which what we have found is that the overall fiscal impacts of immigrants are quite positive. However, unlike refugees or legally admitted immigrants, illegal immigrants generate a modest net deficit. Having said that, I think I should make a couple of points that are germane to Proposition 187. First, it's not at all clear that these average costs would translate into savings, even if all the undocumented immigrants in California were suddenly to disappear. The $1.3 billion that California spends on schools would not suddenly become free to the state of California. Second, these public sector costs represent illegal immigrants, do not represent illegal immigrants' total social costs. That would require a kind of accounting that includes illegal immigrants' impact on the state's economies as workers, as business owners, and as consumers. And that's an accounting that's likely to reveal that while on balance, taxpayers may be losers, consumers and employers may come out ahead in California. And finally, I would just add that to the extent that illegal immigrants are counted in the census, they increase the population base for federal grants that come to state and local jurisdictions in that state. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, very much. Back to you now, Dean Smolensky, for the conclusion of your panel presentations.
Thanks very much, Mr. Royer. Our next speaker is Valerie Small-Navarro, the legislative advocate for the ACLU.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak in front of both coasts. I'm really enjoying the whole idea of doing this teleconference, even minus the TV. When I think about these issues, sometimes I feel like I'm in a bad episode of Saturday Night Live's Deep Thoughts. I think everyone has seen that. And the reason I'm saying that is I think the discourse about immigration and immigrants has shifted into this discussion about illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, and their costs. And I'm not so sure we're asking the right questions. So when the question for this conference was posed, immigration reform, does California have the answers? We have to ask, what are the questions? What are the problems? What are the perceived problems? What are the facts? And I think Michael Fix has done a very good job of taking a 5-minute stab at the facts. And then when we look at answers, we have to ask, does the answer achieve the result? Do we get what we're trying to get to? Does the answer respect the constitutional rights of all people? And finally, is the answer cost efficient? I think those are three simple things to keep in mind when we look at questions at any level on any topic, okay? And I think we're in the process of looking at these questions. Now, why has this been so sexy lately? I think it's really caught the imagination of the American people, this idea of illegal immigration. We see the TV spots, people streaming across the borders, people talking about 9-month pregnant women coming here to the United States to have babies. Well, does everyone remember Willie Horton? That's an image. Does everyone remember welfare queens? That's another image. Well, now we've got illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, wetbacks, whatever you want to call them. That's our new image. And I think the politicians, and I'm not speaking in a partisan way, I think all of our politicians who have latched onto the issue of immigration sometimes lose sight of the facts, and it's the images that take over. So I want to sort of bridge a little bit what Mr. Takaki said earlier, and I want to talk about some of the other real problems. We talked about the recession, and I think for the 93, 94 revenues in the state of California, if we would not have had the recession, say the recession had just evaporated somehow, we would have had $13 billion more in our economy. That's a lot of money, okay? Bridging up over to some of the other issues. The recession is just one tip of the iceberg. Let's look at what happened to our revenue base in the state of California. I know this isn't real sexy stuff. It's actually kind of boring, but let's talk about a little bit about the decimation of the property tax in the state of California. Let's talk about the erosion of the sales tax in the state of California. And let's talk about what people like to call unchecked growth of tax expenditures. And these are the tax loopholes that are out there. Now, Proposition 13 basically, I think, slashed the property income that we were getting as a state by half. Okay? Half. Now, we wonder why our schools and local governments are not doing so well. That is half of the income that's been gone. The purpose was to alleviate the burden on the homeowner. Well, I would assert that it wasn't necessarily the homeowners that had the biggest benefit, but rather the big buildings on Market Street, who now they don't turn over the property as often as normal people, and they're the ones getting the real benefit of that. I just saw I had the 1 minute sign, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. On the federal level, the Commission on Immigration Reform is proposing a national ID card. Well, they're not calling it that, actually. They're calling it a registry. And I think what's been going on in our country is this need. We're looking for a way to solve the illegal immigration problem. Well, sometimes, and I remember what my dad had to say about trying to cure the patient. He kept telling us, well, in order to cure us, he was going to amputate at the neck in order to solve the problem. Well, do we really want to have a big, massive bureaucracy for all of our people for only 1.5% of the people who are here in this country illegally? Thank you.
Right on time, Valerie. That leaves it, that takes us next to Philip Romero, Dr. Romero, from Governor Wiltz's office. Before we begin, can I find out if at Harvard we're coming through okay?
Oh, we hear you just fine.
Oh, great. Okay, Phil.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate the invitation to come here. As Dean Smolensky mentioned, I have my PhD from a sister institution, the Rand Graduate School, and have shamelessly exploited the cheap labor of GSPP and Kennedy School summer interns on numerous occasions. And I got to tell you, they're among the most cost-effective you can find. Now, whether that's because the numerator is high or the denominator is low is an exercise you can leave to the students. Both schools are dedicated to rigorous and dispassionate analysis of important public policy issues, and there are a few issues that cry out for rigor and dispassion more than this, and I speak from experience speaking to a number of audiences. My particular role in this area, I'm not a demographer and I'm not an advocate. My particular role in this area has been helping the governor understand the fiscal and economic implications of illegal immigration. Now, this country has by world standards, a very liberal immigration policy in the sense that we accept about 800,000 legal immigrants a year, something that I think is very much consistent with our national tradition and also with our economic self-interest. But the fact of the matter is, as Michael Fix was referring to earlier, about 300,000 more people arrive or are added to the population every year who arrive, quote, illegally. As Michael Fix mentioned, 7 out of 8 of those illegals settle in just 7 states, and California receives about half of that total. The responsibility for enforcing our immigration policy, in other words, getting that number from 300,000 down closer to 0, is the federal government. But historically, under both Republican and Democratic presidents, the federal government has failed to do so. They're responsible for controlling entry, as I mentioned, and they're also responsible for reimbursing state and local governments for expenses that the federal government shifts to those state and local governments. Speaking for the state of California, we are not interested in materially reforming American immigration policy, to refer to a subject that was mentioned earlier. We generally think that liberal immigration policy is quite appropriate. But what we'd like to see is that policy implemented consistently and fairly, so that California does not absorb a disproportionate burden. Now, why do we absorb that burden? Fundamentally because the federal government has over the years accumulated requirements and imposed them on states. Now, I'll mention briefly findings of a recent report that we published about a month ago, and I have a few copies available here, on the fiscal implications of illegal immigrants in California. Broadly speaking, they're very consistent with the Urban Institute's findings, with one exception with respect to California. We find that illegal immigrants cost California taxpayers approximately $2.4 billion. When you add in the additional, in federal mandates, when you add in additional costs that they impose simply by virtue of being residents of the state and enjoying all the general services that we all enjoy, that adds about another $1 billion. So roughly $3.4 billion in total. That's nearly 1 out of 10 dollars that California state taxpayers pay, that we are obliged to provide to people who are here because the federal government has failed to control entry. Now, they do indeed contribute taxes, and our tax estimate is, for all intents and purposes, identical to the Urban Institute. That's within 1%, $739 million specifically. As Michael Fix mentioned, a true social accounting would go beyond that fiscal analysis, but I want to note that when he speculated about what that accounting would reveal, it was speculation. It is an analysis. I'm not going to suggest one way or another whether a broader analysis would reveal that they are socially beneficial or not. Michael Fix also mentioned that the federal government receives is a net surplus receiver of, in other words, they receive more in tax revenues than they pay out in services for illegal immigrants, but that is clearly not true for state and local governments, and California being an example. Now, in my view, one of the questions that we were asked to address is why is immigration such a hot and button issue this year? A lot of the advocates will argue that there's racial or ethnic backlash, and on those rare occasions where it is true, it is absolutely inappropriate and unfortunate. The right reason for being concerned about this is fiscal. The fact of the matter is that our taxpayers are obliged to pay 1 out of 10 of their dollars to support residents, that are here illegally. The wrong reasons are racial or cultural or economic. I agree with Professor Takagi completely. The primary reason for California's economic recession is the loss of defense dollars. We do not take the position that illegal immigrants are in any way the cause of our economic troubles. And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Philip. Our last speaker for this coast is William Tamayo, the managing attorney for the Asian Law Center.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here this afternoon to share in this discussion. I'd like to pick off a little bit where Valerie left, which is, why is it that when we're talking about an undocumented population, which is only 1.5% roughly of the United States population, where the rest of the country is here legally or U.S. citizens, why is it such a prominent issue in the news these days in California and in Washington, D.C.? And I think, just to kind of put it more concisely, what was said earlier is, it was, as Congressman Becerra says, it was Willie Horton in 1988 and it's immigrants in 1994. That more or less kind of captures the kind of desperate approach that many politicians have towards trying to win elections this year. They are looking at somewhat of a scapegoat to explain away who's to blame for a lot of the other economic problems that we have. Another side issue, not so much a side issue, but I think we have to take notice of the fact that the United States and a lot of Western European nations now are laying the foundations for an ideological consensus that supports the restrictions of rights. Let me say it again. They're laying the foundations for an ideological consensus that supports the restrictions on civil rights. What they're trying to deal with is a global phenomenon. 100 million people, according to the World Bank, have left their home countries trying to find another job. 44 million people are refugees as a result of wars, natural disasters, and so forth. The response of the G7 countries, the top industrial countries, is not to extend a humanitarian hand to these people. Their response is to lock the borders, keep people out any way you can, even if it means stepping on fundamental rights that they may have under international human rights covenants, under the U.S. Constitution, and so forth. That basically is what we're trying to deal with, or is what the government is trying to deal with in a global picture. And it's certainly in the interest not of the migrants who are forced to move, but basically in the interest of those who are in power within the different industrial nations. They're also trying to deal with the fact that there is a collapse in the social order, expected social order, after the Cold War. The Western nations were not prepared for the massive migration that would result after the Cold War. They also were not quite prepared for the massive global migration that would result from the fact that we have a global economy, whether we like it or not. They don't want to quite take responsibility, but their response, though, is keep people out, lock the borders, do everything, restrict rights, and so forth. But you have to lay the basis so that the American public buys into it, and I think politicians, unfortunately, are doing an excellent job from both parties. The other topic I'd like to discuss, though, is this Proposition 187. This is a very real issue for a lot of people. Many undocumented women in San Francisco are calling the social service agencies saying, what do I do on November 9th? Do I go to my doctor? I'm pregnant. Or do I have to stay home? Do I keep my children home from school, my children who are born in the United States? Because they know that their kids will have to reveal the parents' immigration status when they, sooner or later, when they are in school. Bottom line, Prop 187 will not solve the so-called the illegal immigration as portrayed by the proponents of 187. All the major health organizations, police officer organizations, educators have all come out against it. They know this is not the solution. And I think if we're concerned about a fiscal impact, it's pretty clear, according to the California legislative analysts, that California will stand to lose something like $15 billion if Prop 187 becomes law, because 187 violates a whole lot of other federal statutes that, like rights to privacy and so forth, that would have to be violated in order for 187 to go into effect. Just one other issue on the matter of undocumented people's contributions. Yes, it's true, as Mr. Romero said, that undocumented people put more into the federal coffers than they do into the state and local coffers, and that's an issue. But that's the same problem for citizens and lawful permanent residents. They put more into the federal coffers than they do into the state. Maybe that's what the issue needs to be addressed. Is there enough money coming from the federal government in general to pay for the costs that local and state governments have to absorb? Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, all the panelists. At this time, we now return the microphone to Harvard, to Charlie Royer, for a panel response.
Thank you. We have time now for some questions or clarifications or confrontations over what that panel in California has just said. Is there anyone who would like to respond?
I'd like to ask Mr. Romero a friendly question. This is Dennis Hayashi. My question is, I think you laid out in very stark terms some of the concerns of the governor's office relative to the costs of undocumented immigration in California. But having said that, I have sort of a two-part question. One, what is the governor's position relative to 187? And two, if the governor does not support all of 187, are there parts of it that he does support and are there parts of it that he does not support in response to the issues that you raised?
Governor Wilson didn't initiate 187. He wasn't involved in its drafting, but he has endorsed it. I will give you my views, which are close to, but maybe not quite identical to his. It's a blunt instrument. It's a very blunt instrument. It's basically a cry of frustration from state voters who have faced years, as I said, under presidents of both parties. As in fact was just mentioned a moment ago. The comment was made a moment ago that perhaps the right solution would be to reallocate more money from the federal government to the states. Well, coincidentally, that's exactly what Pete Wilson has been attempting to do for a couple of years. Facing virtually no success, he has been obliged to sue, and similarly, some frustrated Californians have been obliged to basically try to take it to the Supreme Court by way of a California initiative. So he supports it as another vehicle for trying to rationalize state and federal fiscal relations in this area.
Let me ask Michael if you agree with the numbers that you heard from Mr. Romero.
I think, Charlie, what we've seen is that our analysis and the state of California's analysis, there's a lot of convergence between the two sets of figures when it comes to the assessments. One of the reasons that California's assessments are higher in some regards is that our analysis was very narrowly constrained to three sets of costs. That is to say, the cost of emergency medical care, the costs of education, and the cost of incarceration, and I believe their cost estimates go beyond that to other services.
All right, there being no other questions from the Boston panel, let's proceed to those presentations, and we begin with Dennis Hayashi, Director of the Office of Civil Rights at Health and Human Services.
Thank you. Let me start by issuing the sort of standard qualifier, which is that the views that I'm expressing today do not represent necessarily the views of those for whom I toil. I think it's fair to say, though, that the administration is very, very concerned, obviously, about the issue of immigration nationally, and that, in fact, the administration has taken many steps over the past couple of years to try to come to terms with this issue, and as sort of a preview, very shortly, the President will be issuing a formal report on the administration's views and initiatives on immigration. And when I say soon, I would say probably within the next week. And I think in that document there will be laid out some things of interest to folks here. Having said that, let me talk a little bit about our views on Prop 187 and some of the things I think I find problematic with the measure. I think it's safe to say that, as most of the panelists seem to agree, Proposition 187 is somewhat of an extreme initiative. And I think what is most troublesome to me with respect to Prop 187 is that it sort of embodies a problem I think we see nationally and also that we see in Congress, which is that we are no longer talking about immigration in straight up terms in a fairly honest fashion relative to controlling undocumented flow or talking about restrictions on legal immigration. We are now politicizing fundamental rights and services for people under the guise of controlling immigration. And when you politicize issues like health and politicize issues like education, you are treading down a slippery slope, which I think has no limit, because I have not heard people put limits on where we think we can stop services to immigrants. For example, are we going to require people to show a green card before trash is collected? Or are people going to have to produce a green card before they're provided electricity or water? I mean, where does this stop? And I think what most bothers some of us who have been examining this issue is that we're not really seriously talking about the true, quote-unquote, magnets which attract undocumented immigrants to the United States. I think many people have assumed, and I know I have assumed, that the primary magnet or the primary reason why people come to the United States is to work. And I don't think it's any secret that many of the people who come from some of the countries represented in the undocumented population, they're impoverished countries and they see opportunity here economically. And I think many studies have borne that out. So it bothers me, actually, to start talking about these other things like health or education as being the quote-unquote primary reasons why undocumented immigrants come to the United States. So my view, basically, is that a lot of the things that are contained in 187 are essentially punitive in nature rather than remedial. They're not really truly addressing the fundamental cause of why people come to the United States, but instead are skirting around the issue to sort of restrict access to other basic services. And I think one of the things that concerns me a lot is that it's an irresponsible way to address the issue of immigration and has potentially very, very dangerous implications for the population in general, particularly in the areas of health. For example, I don't know how many people know that in 1993, California reported more new cases of tuberculosis than any other state, or that during the measles epidemic of 1989 to 1991, California experienced almost 1/3 of the total measles cases nationwide and more than 1/2 of the total measles deaths. Now just think what would have happened if immunization and care for tuberculosis patients was not provided to the general population, but all of a sudden you had to screen the population to determine who got those services and who didn't. Can you imagine the public health problem in that situation? I think also people are somewhat forgetting, and this is my civil rights hat, and I'll let others speak to that who are on the panel in California, but I think people also at times tend to forget that when you're talking about constructing a system to deny or screen out immigrants to receive certain services, you're talking about the population as a whole. And there's two aspects of this. One is whether or not you want to build a system that intrusive, but secondly, where is the money going to come from to build that system? That system is really expensive, and although it's very easy to make suggestions and recommendations of how you stop undocumented immigrants from coming and how you must stop them from receiving certain services, how much is it going to cost? And I have not heard responsible answers to that. Finally, let me also say that I think in the end, the people who get hurt the most are the children. That in fact, when you try to penalize the parents, who are the primary people who make up the undocumented population, you are in effect denying children basic services. And many of these children are citizens. And my question is, who is going to take care of the kids? So having said that, let me say that, again, the administration is very concerned about the issue. There is an ongoing interagency work group within the White House to look at the issue of immigration and come up with responsible solutions. And I hope that together we'll be able to address this issue in a very, very straightforward and responsible manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Roberto Suro from the Washington Post.
I'd like to disagree with several of the panelists who put this on a very tight California focus. I believe that what we're seeing in California is symptomatic of an anxiety and a set of political trends that are felt broadly across the country. In particular, it's an anxiety and a set of fears that have been apparent in our political discourse now for some years, and I think are becoming more expressive than in the past. Immigration doesn't cause these anxieties, but a rejection of immigrants, especially of illegal immigrants, is certainly a powerful way to express that anxiety. It's an anxiety about demographic change, about ethnic competition, about economic insecurities. It's an anxiety about a world that no longer is responsive to American imperatives, about uncertainty over America's place in the world, the nation's direction and purpose. Immigration has become a focal point for all these feelings, and in an almost kind of demonic way, it touches all these hot buttons at once in a way almost no other issue does. The result is that we are almost certainly moving into a period where the emphasis of national policy will be in cutting the numbers. In Congress last year, there was clear animus for some kind of legislation that would increase enforcement on illegal immigration. Certainly, there are several proposals to cut legal immigration as well. The only question, I think, outstanding is how far the nation is willing to go on illegal immigration and whether legal immigration will be drawn into this as well. In California, the debate over immigration policy has been redefined in a way that make it a more effective political instrument in the exploitation of the kind of anxieties that I spoke of. The first and most important fundamental change in the debate is the shift in focus from jobs and economic impact, which was the basis of most of the discussion in the 1980s, to a focus on services and fiscal impact. Most people do not feel that they are competing for jobs with illegal immigrants. Every taxpayer can feel ripped off when they see a political ad stating that billions of tax dollars are being spent on services to people who do not have a right to be in the country. The second fundamental shift in the way the issue has been framed is to blame it on Washington. Governor Wilson has been very effective in portraying illegal immigration as an unfunded federal mandate. The filing of lawsuits, not just by California, but also by Texas and Florida, have further emphasized this notion that this is a function of federal policy. It's something that Washington does to us. Blaming Washington for the nation's problems has proven to be the single most effective political tactic in American public discourse for the last 20 years. Every president since Jimmy Carter, with the sole exception of George Bush, has been elected on the basis of blaming Washington for the nation's problems. Washington and federal policymakers are held in even lower regard in public opinion than undocumented aliens. Finally, the California debate has turned illegal aliens into so many welfare queens, as some other people have mentioned here. Governor Wilson's basic propositions and Proposition 187, basically the logic presented there of this sort of policy is to remove the magnet of services. The idea is that people will stop coming if they're denied services, and the people who are already here will go home. The fundamental policy notion here is that you change behavior by denying public services and benefits. Again, this is a very popular, very well-worn, very fundamental political formulation that has been put to good effect now for several decades. Saying that illegal aliens will go home if their children are deprived of a public education is not much different than saying that poor women will stop having babies out of wedlock if they're denied welfare. It plays on a feeling of being ripped off, of being taken advantage of by people who are less worthy. These political formulations resonate powerfully. However, they do not readily translate into functioning policy. As we watch the fallout of the California political campaign this year, it's important to remember how much rhetoric there has been about the evils of the federal deficit and how little budget cutting has taken place. and to remember how much hand-wringing there has been about welfare policy over the last 20 years and how little real reform has come about.
Roberto, this is Charles Royer. Roberto, quickly, do you have an opinion on why this issue emerges first in California and not in Texas, given your experience?
Well, two things. One, California, the demographic impact, as Michael noted, is far greater in California than anywhere else, and particularly in Southern California. The economic situation is different as well. Texas went through its recession and restructuring earlier in the decade, and in fact, it's one of the reasons why more people went to California. And I think the nature of the culture is different between Texas and California as well. In Texas, the presence of a large Mexican-American population of a border across which people travel a great deal is part of the local identity in a way that's more comfortable, I think, than in California.
Let's go to John Tresvigna, who is Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Legislative Affairs with the United States Justice Department.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be back at the Kennedy School today to address a topic that is so vital to our nation's heritage and to our nation's future. Immigration is the perfect issue for the Kennedy School's mission of providing a framework of careful study and analysis to an issue that is otherwise so associated with emotionalism and passion on every side. Immigration, California, Latinos, and Asians have been a volatile mix since the 1850s. California was officially bilingual until 1879, when the Working Men's Party, led by European immigrant workers, afraid that Chinese would take their jobs, pushed for a second state constitutional convention and removed Spanish from the books so that the Chinese language would not be legitimized. In this century, Japanese Americans were interned not long after Mexicans, including U.S. citizens, were deported in bad economic times. Today, things are different, or at least they ought to be different. Today, the historic barriers to political, governmental, and educational institutions have been removed, and Hispanics, Asian Americans, and people sensitive to the contribution of immigrants can help shape our nation's policies. The Department of Justice, under Attorney General Janet Reno, and the Immigration Service, under Commissioner Doris Meisner, have brought a new intensity to the federal government's twin missions of immigration enforcement on the one hand and family reunification and naturalization on the other. We are being responsive to those who rightfully demand that we enforce the law, to those who believe it is in the national interest to reunite families, fill labor shortages, and reward those who follow the law with naturalization, and to those states who feel unfairly burdened because people from other countries are attracted to them. Saying yes to legal immigration requires saying no to illegal immigration and vice versa. This dichotomy is expressed in the issue of employer sanctions, where the INS enforces sanctions while the Department of Justice Office of Special Counsel for Immigration-Related Unfair Employment Practices enforces the anti-discrimination provisions of IRCA. As we toughen sanctions by targeting industries and employers that tend to rely on illegal workers, agriculture, garment factories, food services, we augment our efforts to protect U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents, asylees, and others eligible to work from being singled out for looking Asian or Hispanic, or otherwise being denied equal employment opportunity. In the area of naturalization, we're making the N of INS a priority and a reality, committing increased resources, working with community-based organizations to publicize the benefits and the requirements of naturalization. We're also streamlining the naturalization process and hiring additional staff to speed the processing of naturalization and planning a hotline, a bilingual Spanish and English hotline, to provide assistance to individuals who want to apply for naturalization. Increased interest in citizenship is in the national interest and is reflected in the number of persons naturalized. In fiscal year 1994, 426,000 persons naturalized, compared to 314,000 in the previous year. This is an accomplishment for which this administration can be proud. In regards to the cost of immigration, we have actively sought to assist states. For the first time ever, thanks to the President's crime bill, the federal government will help states with the cost of incarcerating criminal aliens. The crime bill provides $1.8 billion for criminal alien incarceration over 6 years. Last week, a down payment of $43 million was awarded to the Big Seven states, which account for 80% of the incarcerated criminal alien population. California received itself $33 million and is likely to receive more money this year and much greater funds in the coming years. This funding will augment unprecedented levels of federal aid that California will be receiving to defray costs associated with immigration. President Clinton requested in the FY95 budget $2.5 billion more to reimburse California for educational, health, and other programs serving immigrants than that budget presented by President Bush in 1993. In the last 18 months, we have crafted a strategy for cracking down on illegal immigration at our borders. Operation Hold the Line in El Paso has virtually stopped illegal entry there. This month, we launched a new initiative in San Diego, Operation Gatekeeper. To secure the border with its canyons and mountains, we have developed a strategy different than that in Texas. We have temporarily closed the internal checkpoints in San Clemente, and by January 1st, we will have added 300 agents to the San Diego border over what it had previously, and more are on the way. The crime bill and the FY95 budget provides for 700 more Border Patrol agents in California, Arizona, and Texas, and associated with that has been a decrease in border violence with the increase in Border Patrol. Second, we're lighting every single section of the border that needs it to deter crossers and help new agents detect more people crossing illegally, and we continue again to reduce border violence in that way. Finally, we are fingerprinting every undocumented individual we apprehend. This new fingerprinting policy helps us crack down on criminal aliens, track those who repeatedly break our immigration and criminal laws. Fourth, we are cracking down on alien smugglers by increasing the penalties against those who prey upon those who want to come into the United States. Fifth, we have increased the number of criminal aliens deported from California prisons in cooperation with state prison officials to focus our enforcement efforts on those who break the laws rather than in the more disparate way that others attempt to try to put all immigrants into one basket. And finally, in recognition of the commercial ties between California and Baja California, we will add 110 new inspectors to California ports of entry. Global movement of people is not a problem but a challenge. The administration is working for comprehensive approaches, cooperatively with state and local governments, community leaders, and internationally. Immigration is not just about numbers and borders, it's the futures of families, communities, and nations, and we are beginning to address the problem and address the issue in cooperation with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And now we invite questions of this panel from the California panel for about 5 minutes or so.
The mic is open. Is anybody prepared to answer a question? Philip, I can start. Can I start with this one? You said 187 is blunt. Someone said, on the other side, I think Mr. Hayashi said 187 is punitive. Is it blunt or punitive?
Well, several comments have been made along the lines that 187 would either be very expensive to enforce or in essence, severely restrict the rights or otherwise be discriminatory. I want to point out that the governor has been in favor, and now the Jordan Commission has also endorsed some sort of mechanism for distinguishing who is and isn't eligible for government benefits. And there seems to be wide consensus on this. 187, by and large, just attempts to do that in state law, since the federal government has not done so far itself. When I use the word blunt, what I mean by that is under current Supreme Court decisions, it appears, I'm not an attorney, but it appears that several provisions of 187 would immediately be challenged in courts. I was not involved in that campaign, but I believe that's exactly the drafter's intention. It's another mechanism to try to achieve federal action where action, especially in the area of reimbursement, has until recently been very slow in coming.
Would you please, just for clarity, identify yourselves when you speak?
I just wanted to identify yourself. Sorry. I'm sorry I'm taking so long. Bill, I'm sorry, Bill.
Won't be the first time that's happened. This is Bill Tamayo, and I'd like to ask John Tresbenia a couple questions. Some believe that a stronger employer sanctions program would still continue the discrimination that the General Accounting Office found in its March 1990 report, where it concluded that close to 20% of the employers had been discriminating against Asians and Latinos as a result of the employer sanctions law. And currently, the Office of Special Counsel is only litigating 9 cases of discrimination. So some have concluded that perhaps IRCA has produced a problem that might not be properly resolvable under existing law. So some have advocated either some changes in the anti-discrimination law or out-and-out repeal of employer sanctions and possibly looking at the issue of other types of enforcement. Could you just respond to that one?
The administration does not support repeal of employer sanctions. Clearly, the administration recognizes the discriminatory aspects of employer sanctions, but as you suggest, Bill, if 20% of the employers are discriminating by employer sanctions, and maybe it's higher because a lot of the GAO study asked employers themselves whether they were discriminating, means that the others are not. And if we can get 80% to not discriminate, then the goal is to increase that number to get it up to 100%. One way to do that is to continue with the public education, so people in minority communities and immigrant communities will know what their rights are and that they will have a place to have their rights addressed. And second is to educate and also to enforce the law against employers. This year is the first time we brought a criminal action against an employer. So there are many ways, and the administration does want to increase the Office of Special Counsel and give it a higher prominence and give it greater resources.
Thank you, Valerie.
This is Valerie Small Navarro, and this is a question, I think also for John Trespina, but could be opened up to other people. Half of the people who are in this country illegally, literally one half, have overstayed visas, and all we hear about is the border, the Mexican border, the border this, the border that. We're going to do this at the border. But what happened to the one half of the people who came over on visas? What are we going to do about those folks?
Well, we are also taking efforts in the area of asylum reform, addressing a problem that was well publicized by 60 Minutes a couple of years ago, addressing asylum reform so that at Kennedy Airport and others, we can limit asylum abuse and provide asylum for those legitimate seekers of asylum. Second, there are a number of operations that are not very sexy, not very attractive, and not going to get in the newspaper, but dealing with carrier cooperation. That is addressing visa problems abroad before people get here into the United States. And finally, although you may not like it because it gets back to the other issue, our other effort to address visa overstayers is through employer sanctions in the workplace.
Thank you. Final question? Ron?
Yeah, my name is Ron Tukaki. I think it's a mistake for us to get tied up with the numbers, also with questions of law enforcement. I think we're all students of public policy here, and most of us are students of public policy. And I think as public policy students, it's really important to look at the big picture, where I was trying to note the significance of the economic context. I think there's also a social context here. You know, we're talking about Prop 187. I think Prop 187 is a cold word. It's a word, it's the R word, it's race, okay? Like, what are we talking about when we're talking about people crossing the border? What are we talking about when we talk about illegal immigrants? You know, we're talking about race, okay? But let's not fool ourselves. We're not talking really about illegal immigrants. I think there's a kind of nervousness in California, but also throughout this country, that this nation is becoming a population of peoples of color. By the year 2000, African Americans, Chicanos, Native Americans, and Asian Americans constitute a majority of the people of California. And this is happening throughout every major city in the United States, okay? So when I hear Prop 187, I hear the rumblings of this nervousness, you know, what's going to happen when America becomes a society of non-whites? And the question I have to ask you is, well, what is in the interest of all of us? Is it really in the interest of all of us, including whites? And whites will constitute 70 to 80% of the voters of California this November. Is it in the interest of all of us and also the whites of California to deepen the racial divide as we approach the 21st century?
I'd like to this is Philip Romero from Governor Wilson's office, and I'd like to respond to that. Since the program chair chose not to invite, or else they failed to appear, the Prop 187 advocates, I'll try to take up their case. I have spoken with several of them at length, and I can tell you there is absolutely not a racial or ethnic motivation among them. Yeah, and see, this is the problem. This is precisely the problem. If if you examined the initiative as opposed to imputed motivations on it, you could draw your own conclusions. But I question how many of them here are informed. Now, I absolutely agree with Mr. Takagi, and I think, or Professor Takagi, and I think Roberta Suro phrased this very eloquently. Yeah, there is anxiety in the shrinking Anglo class about the whole issue of the changing demographics of California, and ultimately that will extend to the United States as well. I happen to feel personally, and the governor feels personally, that anxiety is entirely without merit, but it exists. The 187 advocates, however, that's not the motivation. That's not the motivation for their presentation. The final point I wanted to make, since the issue of race has been brought up, is it's not an accident that several polls of Latino groups have found that even Latinos are substantially supportive of 187 and things like it. And the reason is very simply because illegal immigration, and it's absolutely correct, by no means are all of them Latinos, many of them are visa overstayers from other countries. If anybody is economically harmed by illegal immigration, and again, I think on net, society as a whole is not, but if any individuals are economically harmed by illegal immigration, it's recent immigrants of similar skill levels, often from the same ethnicity, who played by the rules, came here and are competing in the labor market against illegal immigrants. Since many of those are Latinos in California, that's precisely why even Latinos are supportive of 187. So let's not pretend that this is some sort of Anglo-racial conspiracy. Even recent legal Latino immigrants realize that illegal immigration is harming their own economic interests.
Well, many of them also feel that illegal immigration is fueling a racist backlash, and that would be
I would agree with that. I would agree with that.
Well, thank you. That takes us directly to our question and answer period. For the next 30 minutes, we will alternate with a question first to this panel, or to this or other panels submitted by our audience, and conversely at the Kennedy School. And Philip, you're on the first
What a
question
surprise.
again. I'm sure you're totally surprised. In one of your office's publications, there is a statement to the effect that an average undocumented immigrant household would have to earn $100,000 to offset what they receive in public services. That figure is difficult to believe. Even conceding that undocumented immigrants take advantage of more public services than legal residents, does that mean that the legal resident households with an income of less than your figure of $100,000 are also, of course?
Okay. First of all, the fact of the matter is California has the most progressive income tax structure in the country. The top 5% of taxpayers pay well over 50% of the total taxes. So the fact of the matter is any low-income household will consume more in services than they receive in tax. And because the federal government mandates illegal immigrants receive certain services disproportionately, one example, for example, is illegal immigrants are, as is mentioned, 5% of California's population, but about 13% of the felons incarcerated in prison. As an example, they're also slightly more than proportionally likely to have kids in school because they tend to be a young population. Because of those federal government mandates, per household with legal immigrant households receive substantially more in services. Now, it is absolutely correct, as the question implied, that, and as I said, that a low-income household of any, whatever residency status would tend to receive more. But there's a big difference. The difference is that we, as California, chose to offer those services to our legal residents. We did not choose to offer them to illegal residents. The federal government chose it for us.
Thank you, Philip. We're over to the Kennedy School.
Okay, let's begin at this microphone. Would you please identify yourself and then ask a question of the California panel?
Hello, my name is Eduardo Perez, and I'm an MPP2 here at the Kennedy School. My question is directed at Mr. Romero and anybody else who wants to address it, actually. What studies have been done to show the effects, if Prop 187 passes, what the effects on California will be? Is California ready to have a lot of undocumenteds who are unhealthy and uneducated, who are going to remain a part of our society?
Well, the governor has already asserted that even if Prop 87 and ultimately a supportive Supreme Court decision of that occurred, even that if that allowed us to eliminate a health mandate for illegal immigrants, I mean, it would be foolish in the extreme to cut costs where public health issues are concerned. He has no interest in eliminating inoculations or letting any epidemic start. So, despite the scare tactics that you sometimes hear, that's not our intention.
Thank you. There's a lot of shaking heads here, but
What a surprise.
They're shaking down here, too.
but the format is a little restrictive here. Our next question is for Mr. Suro. If, as Roberto Suro argues, the anxiety leading to Prop 187 is a result of demographic change, cultural challenges, the role of the U.S., etc., is the focus on illegal immigrants temporary? Will the focus soon shift to legal immigrants, or do Americans distinguish between them?
Well, I think that's a difficult question to answer. I think it's certainly possible. This summer we saw a very fundamental shift in the way a very important refugee population was perceived. Cubans for the last 35 years were probably the most privileged group of immigrants coming to the United States, both in terms of legal status and the financial aid available to them on resettlement over the years. And really, with a stroke of the pen, in response to political pressures from Florida, President Clinton declared them illegal immigrants and put people who had once been welcomed as Cold War trophies behind barbed wire in Guantanamo, and no one complained. The reaction or lack of it, I think, is almost as interesting as the policy itself. And it indicates that certainly this sort of perception does have a capacity to move. Mr. Trasmino mentioned the basic policy formulation of the Clinton administration, which is to say that to say yes to legal immigration requires saying no to illegal immigration and vice versa, that there's an inherent link between the two, that as a matter of policy, the two are joined at the hip. The result of that formulation is an argument already being presented by people like Senator Simpson of Wyoming in a bill that he drafted and introduced last year, and if the Republicans take control of the Senate, he will be chairman of the Immigration Subcommittee in the Senate, and I promise you this bill will be on the floor by next spring, which argues for a substantial cut in the number of legal immigrants based on the argument that the government has failed to stop illegal immigration. It takes the corollary of the administration's argument and says that saying yes to legal immigration requires saying no to illegal immigration, and says that if you can't stop illegal immigration, then you must cut legal immigration. So the potential for this policy or this discussion to involve other aspects of immigration, I think, is quite real.
Michael Fix would like to get in on this question, too.
One area where I think you can see the problems of illegal immigration bleeding into the problems of legal immigration is in welfare reform. What you saw this year was a departure from public policy, say, over the last 10 to 15 years, which is focused very much on limiting illegal immigrants' access to public benefits. This year it shifted to the question of limiting legal immigrants' access to public benefits, and it played out very much in the whole supplemental security income debate, and I assure you that it will be a centerpiece of welfare reform as it comes up in the next Congress.
Next question from California.
First, final comment from Bill Tomasi.
I just wanted to respond a little bit to the question of what will be the impact of 187 if it passes. Contrary to what Mr. Romero has said, I think there will be a health epidemic. TB will spread, as Mr. Hayashi alluded to, and many children will be born with a lot of deformities or other disabilities because their mothers will not be seeking prenatal care at public health facilities. We will have to pay for that. These children will be U.S. citizens. In terms of spreading disease, Are we saying that we will only give them shots when the governor has declared that there's an epidemic going on in the state? Because that would qualify as the quote-unquote emergency exception under Prop 187. Finally, I think the other impact will be great is that many people simply will not have documents on them when they apply for social services or medical services to show that they are lawfully in the United States or that are U.S. citizens. I would guarantee you that at least 99% of you who are U.S. citizens don't carry proof that you are a U.S. citizen. And we'll have a hard time getting some documentation on that. The result will be that U.S. citizens and permanent residents will be denied services, and it will be presumed that you're here illegally, and your name will be referred over to the INS. And the INS won't have a record on you, so they'll assume you're here illegally, because it doesn't list all the people who are born in the United States.
Charlie, I think the next question is due from the Kennedy School. That question.
All right. Sir.
My name is Larry Singer. I'm from Sacramento, California, and here with the Senior Executive Fellows Program at JFK. I first of all, don't support 187, and we'll have an opportunity to vote against it. But at the same time, I think it's important to note that the California initiative system often produces extreme answers when the leadership fails to produce reasonable answers to problems. And there are a lot of problems with 187, but the fact that most Californians, Asian, Hispanic, Anglo, are all very frustrated with the very large problem we have with illegal immigration, and the fact that both the Urban Institute and the governor's office both support the idea that approximately 1 out of every $10 of state budget goes to pay for those, has people desperately looking for a solution. Mr. Trasvina has suggested that the administration accepts responsibility for dealing with the illegal immigration issue, but only about $275 million of the approximately $3.5 billion has come. My question is, and to Mr. Trasvina, I'm sorry for breaking the format, but if the administration were to respond to Texas, Florida, and California and pay for some of these costs associated with supporting the illegal immigration problem that you have accepted responsibility for, I believe the initiative wouldn't have as strong a chance of passing as it appears to have in California this year. Can you respond to why you're fighting the suits from these states?
Well, we're fighting the suits from the states because they don't have legal merit. The issue of whether we're the first administration to request money from Congress. The provision under which we requested money was something passed in 1986. We were the first administration to request money, and it was the first Congress to receive money, to appropriate the money, and it was far less than what we had asked for. There are any number of ways that the federal government assists the state of California and others and other states, whether it's medical care, whether it's education, whether it's immigrant assistance or Title VII bilingual education. The federal government does provide some type of assistance. The real issue is the way to cut down on the cost of illegal immigration is for illegal immigrants not to be there in the first place. And the best dollars are spent on prevention, or the best dollars are spent at the border before people get into the United States. And that has been our fundamental approach. If I could just add on, in terms of 187, the Department of Justice has not taken a position on the initiative. But earlier this year, Congressman Rohrabacher of California introduced an amendment to an education bill that would have required schools to provide information on people they thought were illegally here or the parents were illegally here to the INS. And the Immigration Service came out very strongly against that amendment because that is not the way we want to spend the INS resources, to go after children, to go after parents. Well, we want to spend the INS resources not on those individuals, but our priorities are on getting criminal aliens out of the jails and back into their home countries, wherever those home countries may be, and also to deal with problems at the border before the problem exists in the state itself.
Dennis Hayashi.
Let me reiterate something that my colleague, Mr. Trasvina, said. I think that, as he explained, with respect to the lawsuits, there are some fundamental legal issues which cannot be ignored, and therefore the suits must be defended. But on the basic issue of sharing costs with the states, I think the administration has indicated it is willing to discuss how we share resources in terms of addressing these problems. One of the fundamental issues, though, is how much does it really cost? And I think Mr. Fix's study had some numbers which contradicted some of the states' estimates. I think there will also be some attempt by the Commission on Immigration Reform to address how much these services actually cost. And so once we get a really good idea of what the costs are, then let's talk about how we share those costs. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Romero would like to comment.
Yeah, just a quick comment on the question that was asked of Mr. Trisvina. In fairness to the Clinton administration, I want to note that California's congressional delegation is by no means, pure on this issue. While our legislative leadership in Sacramento has been quite united in requesting a reimbursement, that has not been true of our congressional delegation. There are continued partisan squabbles on this. Beyond that, we as a state and the other 7 states face an uphill battle because we are only 7 states.
One final comment here, Ron.
Yeah,
Say who you are.
Professor Takaki, when we talk about cost, we're really talking about education, because most of it is being spent for education. The question I have to ask is whether or not we want to deny education to the children of illegal immigrants, because if we kick them out of school, where are they going to be? They're going to be in the streets. Maybe it's no wonder then that we also have on the ballot an initiative for 3 strikes and you're out, because this is what's going to happen to them. We're going to create a large criminal class that will have to be put into prison. And so in the end, when we talk about costs, we're having not 3 strikes or out, but 3 strikes and the state is broke.
I never thought that the 10th campus of the University of California, Berkeley, would be at San Quentin myself. I do have a question for any panelist, but perhaps Mr. Scaffini, you might want to take it up first, or Mr. Hayashi. The question runs like this: do you think that if the quotas for legal immigration were increased, then we would have less illegal immigration? That cuts against the conversation that went just a few minutes ago.
I'm not sure I heard the question, but
If the quotas for legal immigration were increased, would that reduce illegal immigration?
well, we do know that when there are tremendous backlogs for legal immigration and family units, whether they're brothers and sisters or whether their spouses and children are kept apart, then there is an incentive to come in illegally. And I think I want to go back to the other point about whether a moratorium is the answer, because it's not the answer. The answer is cutting back on illegal immigration, cutting back on legal immigrants, the people who have waited in line, people who want to be reunited with their families, people who have been asked to come into the United States because the employers have already found there are no Americans to do those jobs. That's not those aren't the people that ought to be penalized because they're illegal immigrants coming into the country. So there really is, when we get into 1995 in the next Congress, there really ought to be no link between cutting back on legal immigration is not a solution that that this administration supports.
Roberto Sura?
Yeah, I'd like to pose a question to the Berkeley panelists, specifically perhaps to Mr. Tamayo, but also to some of his colleagues. Mr. Tamayo, you depicted immigration as this large global phenomena with a great many tens of millions of people in motion, and spoke of the industrialized nations moving towards restriction, specifically restricting the rights to movement. Some of your colleagues have spoken negatively about border enforcement, have spoken negatively about employer sanctions. I'm curious if, in fact, you see this as a large global challenge and see the likelihood of migration continuing to be a major policy challenge for the federal government. If you oppose restriction, then what do you advocate?
Well, I think we should be clear. I didn't specifically say I oppose restrictions or did I say I wanted open borders or so forth. I think what the nations, industrial nations in particular, have to do is think somewhat responsibly, which is really examine why there is this global migration, and are they part of the problem? Have the industrial nations created this forced migration from a lot of countries? It was alluded to earlier that, in fact, people are leaving countries. The top sending countries are Mexico, the Philippines, El Salvador, and a lot of other countries whose economies have been greatly impacted by Western nations, and particularly the United States' economic and political policies. That's the responsible approach, to look at that and then examine what would be then the responsibility if certain nations are responsible for this migration. Is it to start cutting down on rights at the border or deprive people of certain due process when they come in trying to seek political asylum? Or is it examining the conditions in the sending countries and perhaps increasing the quotas that have forced people to wait so long to be able to come into the United States? I think these are some of the approaches that they're going to have to look at. My bottom line is people do not leave their countries unless they have to. That's just the natural history of humankind. People generally don't leave where they've been where they were born or grew up with, unless economic or political conditions really force them to leave.
May we now have a question from our audience for California? And you're up next.
My name is Claudia Martinez, and I was the policy analyst for MALDIF in Sacramento for about 2.5 years, and I'm currently an MPP first year here at the Kennedy School. My question is primarily for Mr. Romero and anybody else who wants to respond on the panel. It's more of regarding the political nature of things that are going on in California surrounding the initiative. One of Mr. Romero's comments, I believe, early on was that Governor Wilson is more concerned about changing policy and the effects of what he calls federal mandates in California, and not really concerned with affecting national policy. And I have a difficult time reconciling that with his endorsement of Proposition 187, which would pose a challenge to the Supreme Court decision requiring that education be afforded to all students throughout the nation. That has national impact. So my question is, how is Governor Wilson reconciling that? And the second part of that would be his comments regarding that this is not a racial issue and that Governor Wilson does not promote the racial content or animosity in this whole issue. However, I have not, in the entire time that I was in California over this issue, heard Governor Wilson come out against incidents surrounding immigrants and their abuse of their rights throughout the campaign, and I would suggest that he's actually benefited, whether he endorses that aspect or not, he has benefited from the racial aspects of the issue and the hostility against immigrants. So I'd like some response to that.
Okay, Philip Romero here. First of all, I may have not been clear, which resulted in the paradox that you thought you heard. What I said was that he is supportive of a liberal legal immigration policy and therefore is not a supporter of moratoriums or reductions in current quotas. What he would like is to have that policy actually be implemented so that we do not have 300,000 exceptions to it a year. To your second point about the racial issue, well, a couple of points. First of all, when Pete Wilson first got interested in the subject as mayor of San Diego, specifically because he saw substantial abuse, downright terrorism against illegal immigrants threatening to cross the border, and we all know about some awful, awful stories of that. Second, I have been in several meetings with him with Latino leaderships, including in particular a well-organized organization called Pride of state and federal Latino leaders, where he's spent time talking to them about this issue. And several times at the end of the meeting, I've heard him say, if your absolute color blindness and concern about the conditions of these people, if it was more apparent out, why can't you get the same message that we've heard today out there? And the answer is, quite frankly, part of it is our own fault. When you try to make changes, you have to raise your voice loudly, and your message gets simpler than it should be. And part of it, in my opinion, is frankly the filtration of the media.
I have a question from the floor that's just an obvious follow-up on that. Mr. Romero, you claim that Pete Wilson does not advocate 187s for its race-based characteristics or for its economic sense. Why then are his advertisements based on the image of undocumented people crossing the border? And why and how is he preparing for the chance of violence should the 187?
Well, two-part answer to that. First, entirely personally, that is the aspect of with which I am personally least comfortable. I am not a political specialist, but what campaign people tell me is you need good visuals, and I am personally deeply I'm not defending it. I'm simply explaining it. I personally am deeply troubled by that particular advertisement. Would you repeat the question? I think there was a second part to it.
Well, there was also a question of whether or not, if it passes, the administration expects violence, and if so, are they prepared?
The administration expects violence.
Something like after the Kings. No such notion in mind.
I guess I don't understand the premise of the question, so I can't really respond to it. But I'll point out one last point is that in the gubernatorial campaign is a gubernatorial campaign, and he is not spending any money doing any commercials or making actually a lot of very much significant effort with respect to 187%. That commercial is a commercial that troubles me, but it's part of the gubernatorial campaign, not the 187 campaign.
I think it's important, this question of violence. I think this is Bill Tamayo. I think it's important to address this question of violence because there's no accident, and the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, Federal Justice Department, the Attorney General's office in California under John Vandekamp has documented that when a lot of this anti-immigrant sentiment increases, there are acts of racial violence, primarily aimed at Asians and Latinos. It's happened up and down this state in the last 10, 15 years in increasing amounts. I believe if 187 passes, it constitutes somewhat of a public and governmental imprimatur on those who want to carry out acts of racial violence because they will think it is their God-given birthright to basically start beating up people who don't look like them and just say, you guys are wetbacks, you guys shouldn't be here, we're going to kick you out, and know that perhaps the prosecutor is going to be too busy and not ever prosecute it as a hate crime. And I think we have enough cases documented by both Justice Departments in California and in the federal government that this is a growing problem. And I think this is unfortunately going to be a consequence if 187 passes.
Yeah, I'm glad Mr. Tamayo made his comments because it reminded me of one thing I wanted to say. The crazies can choose excuses for doing awful things, and it would be very unfortunate if anyone uses 187 as such an excuse. But 187 is entirely about restricting eligibility for state-funded benefits. It is not remotely, there's not a word in there about race. Pete Wilson, and the comment I wanted to make that I forgot to make before, is that in his term, he has pushed for and signed the toughest hate crime legislation the state has ever had.
Charlie, you've got the last question.
Yes, sir.
Institute for Learning and Retirement. It troubles me that of the 10 panelists on both coasts, there's only one supporter of Proposition 187. So I wonder if any attempt was made on either coast to get more representation of the opposing viewpoint. I also would be very grateful before there's any more beating up on Proposition 187 to have one of the scholars on either coast, rather than advocates, explain in simple, objective terms just exactly what is Proposition 187. Thank you very much.
I guess my name is Gloria Corral, and I'm one of the people organizing the conference on the California side. And to respond to that, I'd simply like to say that the comments that were addressed about 187 were not in any way intended to be, A, supporting or being denying or against Prop 187. The fact of the matter is that it's on the ballot, and for whatever reason, the people on the panel chose to speak about that, and that was not, we didn't feel that there was a need to provide anti or for pro 187 panelists simply because that's not the only issue that we wanted to address. And there was another question?
It was simply, in simple terms, explaining the essential features of 187. Since I am clearly considered a tainted advocate, I will demur and invite someone else to do that, if they can do it in a reasonably objective way.
Do I have a volunteer somewhere? Phil, run down.
Well, again, this isn't the governor's initiative, so this is a pretty superficial description. And I invite anybody to correct me on factual omissions or mistakes. But my appreciation of 187 is, in essence, would make it illegal for the state to provide state-funded services to illegal immigrants, and it would oblige state and probably local employees also to establish the eligibility for those services, leading to, for instance, the charge that teachers and doctors would become de facto INS agents. Is that sort of the essence of it?
Yeah, you left out one important aspect
Okay,
of the proposition, which is that it would also require any state employee who was engaging in that verification procedure to report any individual suspected of being an illegal alien, both to the state attorney general's office and to the Immigration and Naturalization Service. And in the case of schools, let me add, even if a child registering for school in California was a natural-born U.S. citizen, and the administrator registering that child suspected that the child's parents were illegal aliens, they would be required by law to report that suspicion, and there is no definition of what would constitute suspicion.
Everybody agrees that that was correct. Well, unfortunately, our time is up. I want to thank the students who have worked so hard to make this come off. You've already heard on our side from Gloria Corral, Rod Falcone, and Larry Natividad, and Alex McBain, and James Tomas have all been done remarkable work on this side. Charlie, I'm sure you have some students to thank there.
Yes, indeed we do. Claudia Jason, Linda Yu, Michelle Liu, Mary Lou Fulton, and of course our facilities and media services people, and the Hispanic Review and the Asian American Policy Review. Those individuals worked very hard to make this happen. I think it was a good discussion, even without the pictures. It may have reminded some older people around that this is what radio was like in the old days when we communicated in a much less visual way, maybe sometimes in a little better way. Let me thank you, Dean Smolensky, and all your people in Berkeley, and I do hope we get a chance to do this again.
Thank you. We're going to give it every try. Goodbye.
Now, our panelists have agreed to stay for a period of time, and let's just use the microphone. I'm sorry we didn't get to you. We had 90 minutes of telephone time, and we used it up. So let's go to you.
It's probably not still appropriate because I was going to ask Philip Romero something, but maybe you all can comment on it, which is this whole question of magnet of services ignores most of the literature on immigration, points to the demand for workers as being the leading thing that attracts people to this country, and that seems to be sort of left out. In particular, I wanted to ask about Governor Wilson's apparent flip-flop on this, and even though you can maybe comment on it, which is when IRCA was passed, Governor Wilson in a radio call-in show called for the relaxation of standards for letting in farm workers because he thought that the restrictions were too great on farm workers and would prevent growers from getting the workers they needed, and now he's apparently switched his position in regard to immigration. And I'm wondering, even though you can't comment for him, obviously, what ideas you all might have about why.
There are a lot of people who have got a little exposure on this issue. I mean, as a senator, you're right, Wilson represented the interests of the California growers, and in fact has been semi-consistent to the extent that he's always advocated some kind of a guest worker program, and advocated that during the debate in the 1980s, and when that failed, then pushed for measures that ensured a substantial supply of agricultural workers, and redefinition of the amnesty for illegal aliens to include a second broad amnesty for agricultural workers. It's worth noting, however, that one of the architects of that and one of the chief water carriers for the California growers at the time was Leon Panetta, then a congressman and now the White House chief of staff.
Let me posit a question to you, and it's, we don't have anybody here or in California hooked up who can answer this question, but as a former elected official, it struck me as something we didn't address, and that maybe at the government school, at this government school, where we try to teach about this, it ought to at least get on the floor, and that is the connection between campaigning and governing. It seems to me that the Willie Horton ads and the ads of dark figures streaming across the border to almost Jaws kind of music, foreboding music, raising the temperature around this issue, raising passions, appealing to the basest instincts that these negative little 30-second missiles of destruction, which are those TV ads, actually cause, is something that as Americans, we ought to be concerned about. Because the policy discussion we've just had circled all around the realities of the political debate on this issue versus the policy issues. The Urban Institute can do lots of studies, can come up with lots of numbers, but a 30-second spot that inflames people who are anxious and nervous over the way their lives are changing is very dangerous stuff, and somehow has to get connected with governing. And I just think it's something that you may want to comment, but it seems to me that it's pervasive in our society, and we ought to think about that, particularly at a place like the Kennedy School, and think about how we might ultimately deal with that as people who care about these issues. Michael?
I would just comment on that, that kind of ad maybe plays different on an issue that people haven't discussed at length, essentially a new issue before the public eye. In other words, if you think about issues that are sort of well-worn and well-argued, like abortion and taxes and race, these are issues that have been out there for a long time. The public eye has not really been on immigration as an issue. And a lot of people are in the kind of position where they're formulating opinions on what was formerly a fairly obscure phenomenon to them. And so these ads may have even a greater impact in a situation where opinions are not formed than in places than around issues where they're more fully developed.
All right, let's go to your question.
Good evening. My name is Kimberly Gates. I'm a first-year student here at the Kennedy School of Public Policy. I want to thank you, Mr. Royer, for commenting on the obvious avoidance of the politics and, of course, the race issue in relation to this. And I had a question in particular for Mr. Soro and whoever else might want to comment on this. Mr. Soro, you had commented on how the Initiative 187 would, in a sense, oblige educators and physicians to I guess, confirm suspicions of being undocumented. What do you suggest may be their basis for suspicion? Would that be possibly race?
That's not at all defined in the proposition. And you know, the opponent's view is that the obvious people would if somebody came in and had inadequate documentation, which is something that as somebody mentioned, a lot of people would have trouble in this room documenting their citizenship or immigration status with pulling something out of their wallet right now. I guess the opponent's assumption is that people would be chosen by their racial characteristics, language skills, last names, as such for likely suspicion. The proponent's argument is that that they didn't want to project a kind of big brother thing, and that the suspicion is, they use the word as in somebody who is a suspect of a crime, and that there would have to be some sort of reasonable formulation of suspicion before somebody was reported, but this isn't at all spelled out. What is clear is that it's an attempt to use public services in an extension of a kind of police power, which hasn't been the case before. I mean, it goes beyond the simple denial of public service to try and use the facilitation of public services as a means of immigration policy, of actually of initiating the removal of people. Can I ask a question, as long as I've got the microphone?
Can I respond to your point?
Sure.
Just respond also to this point, which is that I think is an extension of what you've just said. The other thing that's very troublesome about the initiative is that it would, in some interpretations, compel doctors to break the doctor-patient privilege. And that is a very, very serious public policy problem. I'm not sure that any of us in Health and Human Services could ever justify that type of behavior, and I think that's just one of the major problems with 187 as well.
This actually leads to the question I wanted to pose to you. I too was absolutely shocked at the idea that health care could be politicized. That's certainly something that no Democrat, and certainly the Clinton administration, would never attempt to do. I'm just absolutely dumbfounded at the idea that somebody would want to politicize something as pure and pristine as health care. On the subject, given the fact that the president did once hold up a piece of identification, how would you propose screening out people by way of their immigration status, should the federal government ever be in a position to extend health benefits in some way similar to what was proposed last year?
You know, this is a really interesting question because actually, in working on this issue recently, one of the things that we've discussed a lot is what went into the construction of the health security card and the protections that were supposed to be built into the security system around health and patient records. And in fact, it is a very, very complex subject. And so my answer to you is really no answer, because essentially I think what it is this issue of the registry and the card that was brought up in the Commission on Immigration Reform report is one I think that the administration feels deserves attention, but you can't just throw it out there and say this is the answer. I think there are a lot of questions that have been raised about how you do it, what protections you have on it. I tell you, the health security people spent months working on this issue, and
But that proposal is, as I recall, the administration proposal was to deny benefits to illegal aliens, which would have required some way in which the federal government, very much the way that underlies Proposition 187, which the administration now is at least unofficially opposing, would require a verification and a judgment on immigration status before the extension of a benefit. I'm not sure how you managed to put so much distance between yourself and Proposition 187, since that was the original intent of the administration's health bill.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's true, though, isn't it, that that illegal immigrants do not get Social Security, and that there's an identification system and a means of eligibilizing.
And they would not be covered by universal health care as proposed by the Clinton administration.
That's right. Although one thing to remember is that the Health Security Act did not cut back on the federal benefits and medical services which the undocumented now receive, which is emergency care. And I think there was a recognition that in certain impacted states they would continue to receive care at clinics in rural areas and urban areas, and that in the Health Security Act there was a provision for financial assistance to those clinics to help offset the cost of that care. But you're right, the Security Act did not provide for a card for the undocumented, and how that was going to be implemented is one of those issues that was not fully fleshed out at the time that the Security Act was sent to Congress.
You've been standing there for a long time.
My name is Monica Alvarez. I'm a sophomore at the college, and I have a question about NAFTA, the repercussions it'll have on the immigration problem. Operation Hold the Line, could it have been helped by the twin plant proliferation on the borders?
I think there are a lot of short-term and long-term answers to NAFTA and its impact on immigration, and immigration's impact on NAFTA. There are those who say that with the changes in agricultural planning in Mexico, that would displace people and would encourage them to come to the United States. I think the long-term, and not too distant long-term, is that NAFTA would be one of the things that would help keep people from being pushed out of Mexico and really it is Mexico, but other countries as well, look at other international agreements, so that while on the one hand it would perhaps encourage people to leave the interior and come to the border, one would hope that they would stay at the border rather than continue across, given that they would have some economically viable jobs in Mexico.
You have the last question, sir.
Hi, my name is Eddie Ramirez Duque. I'm an MPP UP2 here at the Kennedy School. And my question was if you members of the panel could expand on the benefits that were being discussed that consumers and employers gain from illegal immigration, or so-called illegal immigration here to this country, and what types of jobs specifically we're talking about, and whether or not, and my second part of that is, has there ever been a study of how much we've been expending on this so-called problem compared to the cost that presumably illegal immigration is imposing on this country?
In terms of the cost that we've been the dollars that we've spent on curbing illegal immigration in the United States. You have to remember that it wasn't until the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act that it was illegal for employers to hire illegal aliens to work in the workplace. And one of the things that's very interesting is the legacy and the history of IRCA. It was ushered in as kind of a brave new world of immigration enforcement, and we did a major study of how it progressed over time. And at the end of a year to 2 years, INS offices in this country had already reduced it to their second or third priority behind drug enforcement, and the number of dollars that were being spent on it was, on employer sanctions enforcement, was comparatively low. Most of the money was going into the border, and even there the focus was mostly on drugs. The fact of the matter is that our attention wavers from the question of illegal immigration, and only when it becomes a political issue do we care.
Okay, well, let's thank our panel for sticking with us and for an excellent program.